Welcome to Beyond the Coverage. I'm Chris Horner. In today's edition, I want to go back to Amstel Gold Race. I want to examine a little bit how Mathieu van der Poel looked at Amstel Gold Race and try to figure out what went wrong. The simplest answer for sure at this moment is it's not very clear when you watch Amstel Gold what happened with Mathieu van der Poel. You look at his interview afterwards, he said he just didn't have it. His team could be a little bit stronger, but in general they were pretty happy with how it went. And when I look at it, I kind of find that what he's saying that could be true. It could be true that he just wasn't 100%. Many times throughout my career, especially throughout the later parts of my year when we're talking about 2015, 2016, when I'm racing for Airgas and Lupus, I had the lung issue come into effect, and I knew I was never 100%. And so when I was riding with my teams during those years in 15 and 16, I always told the guys on the team, I can make the front group, I can get in the top 10, but if you guys think you can win, you guys always have the green light to go for the win, whether if it's GC, whether if it's for the stage, whatever race we're in, you always have the green light to go. If you don't think you can win, we go back to plan one, which is going to be to put me as close to the front through all the technical difficult sections, like we saw yesterday with Mathieu van der Poel and his Alpecin-Deceuninck team, when they were putting Mathieu van der Poel in fantastic position throughout the whole of Amstel Gold. Now, I didn't get to see the first 160 kilometers of the race. No one did. The cameras came on at 90, but we know everything was wrapped back up with 70 kilometers to go with that original group of 4. And then we start seeing with Alpecin-Deceuninck with about 55 kilometers to go. That's when we see Oscar Riesebeck coming out the back. That's followed quickly by Xander Mayus. And then Axel Laurence comes out with about 49 kilometers to go. Those last two will kind of get on and come back off, but they're not at the front helping out Mathieu van der Poel because their legs have been spent from 200 kilometers of riding already Amstel Gold. They were fantastic. Alpecin-Deceuninck were fantastic as a team. Don't forget that no matter what I say later here and Beyond the Coverage. But when we get further into about 38 kilometers to go, we see Søren Kragh Andersen. He starts coming out the back there of the group. And then Mathieu van der Poel's left with one teammate when the real action starts happening. If I back the film all the way up to about 45 kilometers, as I told you yesterday in the butterfly effect, that's when Michael Kwiatkowski started the real action for the GC favorites. We see Mathieu van der Poel right away. He's following the move from Team Ineos, and he looks fantastic. Throughout the rest of the part from 45 all the way into about 36 kilometers to go, Mathieu van der Poel, when I rewatched it even this morning, watching all the highlights of Mathieu van der Poel covering the tacks, again, he looks spotless. He was covering moves with small accelerations out of the saddle, then sitting back in the saddle. Looked fantastic. We get into 36 kilometers to go. This is when the race is going to start to blow up. We got only 2 riders off the front. That's Mikel Honoré up there and Paul Laperia up there. And then we start seeing the tack in the back, and it's coming from Richard Carapaz from EF Education. Mathieu van der Poel's on this move right away. And again, to me, sitting on the Chesterfield, he looks like he's not suffering at all. But then we start seeing the tacks with Mark Hirschi going up the road with 3 riders. Then we start seeing Pello Bilbao jumping across. We start seeing FDJ riders with their second riders coming across in the group. And then we start seeing Thijs Benoot, Tom Pidcock, and Kevin Vauquelin going across over the top when it's a little bit flatter. And again, we don't see Mathieu van der Poel following multiple different attacks. But when we start looking at the front group that becomes 12 riders, there's a threats up there all over because in 12 riders, there's only one team with 2 teammates, and that's FDJ. That means there's 11 different teams. Visma Lease Bikes up there. We see Ineos is up there. UAE team members with Mark Hirschi, he's up there. They got a host of the top second page of riders. The biggest thing I told you in Beyond the Coverage when we talked about Amstel Gold was when we compare it to Paris-Roubaix, Paris-Roubaix had one rider on the second page. His name's Mads Pedersen. But when we show up at Amstel Gold, I told you there's at least 10, if not a dozen. And in this front group, I listed Mark Hirschi up there on the second page. I listed Thijs Benoot up there. And of course, I listed Tom Pidcock as being one of the big-time favorites on that second page of favorite riders here at Amstel Gold. So when you look at that 12 riders up there and you look at 11 different teams, Mathieu van der Poel missed a move. There's no doubt about it. But I just wonder, because a lot of times the cameras were missing some of the action. When we see the splits really start happening, Mathieu van der Poel's isolated, but it's not going to take very long for Quinten Hermans, who's on fantastic form. Quinten Hermans won a stage at the Basque Country, right? So he gets back to the front. He has some help from Jaco Lula up there riding, and they have some help from Intermarché. Now we get all the way into 18 kilometers to go. The gap is still doable. When I was texting my friends while watching Amstel Gold, I said, okay, we're 18 kilometers to go. The gap's about 35, 40 seconds to the front group of 12. That group's been attacking each other a few different times, but they're still all together when they start the Culberg proper. We're just under 18 kilometers to go. We see one EF Education, Mikel Honore, get dropped out of that group of 12. Now we got 11 up there. That actually is going to help Mathieu van der Poel because, of course, with EF Education getting dropped out of the front group, that means they no longer have a rider up there, so they're going to start chasing. But before we can get to that, we got to start going up to Culberg. Right away when we see the GC favorites in the peloton hit the Culberg in that last left turn before the climb starts proper, we see Skilmos throwing in a big attack. He's throwing an attack, and again, Mathieu van der Poel looks good, sitting 6th, 7th, 8th position back there, but looking solid. We see the attack from Benoit Cosnefroy from Decathlon AG2R. He's throwing a huge acceleration, and Mathieu van der Poel, you should see him do a bit of acceleration in the back coming from the 6th, 7th as the gap starts to open up in front of the EF Education rider. Mathieu van der Poel's closing that gap, sitting back down, goes straight back up and closes the gap up there to Benoit Cosnefroy himself. That on the Culberg shows that Mathieu van der Poel's in fantastic shape. So again, it's difficult to tell for me personally. Normally I can spot when riders are suffering and hurting a little bit, but with Mathieu van der Poel on the Culberg, he looks fantastic. Now we get near the top of the Culberg, it starts to ease up a little bit, and we see attack from Michael Matthews. Michael Matthews would be a second page rider, there's no doubt about it, but the climbs are a little too stiff here for Michael Matthews, and I believe when you're trying to put him on the second page, I don't think he's a rider that can win Amstel Gold because I don't think it's going to come down to ever be in a 10-rider group at Amstel Gold. I know sometimes they're kind of strung out going over the Culberg in the old days when it finished closer, but now with the way it's set up and the way the racing's so aggressive, all the way from 80 kilometers to go into the finish of most of these big-time classic one-day monument races. I like to call Amstel Gold a monument. Sorry, but that's what I'm going to do. It's my show. But when we see Michael Matthews throw an attack on a softer spot there, Michael Matthews has an incredible explosion. So you see he throws in an attack. We look over to the left at the back of the peloton back there, and we see Mathieu van der Poel, and he's looking over to his left, but he's not closing the gap. But then look just a few hundred meters later when there's 9 riders up there that are going up the road, and it's Mathieu van der Poel that's going to close the gap himself. To close the gap up to 9 riders up there with Michael Matthews going full tilt, full power, and he's a sprinter, a field sprinter, you know Mathieu van der Poel's got some form. So again, he closes the gap, we bring it back, we go over the finish line here just after the Culberg, and we're starting to do the last and final lap here of Amstel Gold. We look at the gap, it's about 35 seconds, so there's still a shot to win. We get into 13 kilometers to go, and that's when you see the 4 riders up front with Liege-Bastogne drilling it, Mark Hershey there, Tom Pidcock, and of course we see Mari van Savenoff from Soudal Quickstep make that 4-rider split up there. But behind, we got the race kind of controlled with EF Education on the front, Intermarché helping out, Israel Premier Tech I'd seen at the front throughout the whole time when they'd been chasing on and off as riders were coming and going. But EF Education solidly on the front. We see Vandenberg there, he crashes off into the fencing. I forgot to put that into the race yesterday, so I'll add it here there. And that's going to mean EF Education, of course, are going to be a little bit less motivated because they're going to have to hesitate. And then when we come out of the last corner with about 1.1 kilometers to go, that's when we see Liege-Bastogne throwing his last attack. Comes down to the sprint. Tom Pidcock wins the sprint here at Amstel Gold. But we look back there, Mathieu van der Poel all the way with EF Education chasing even after they crashed with Vandenberg going into the fencing. That would have been the moment where Mathieu van der Poel would have just had to throw in a big dig at that moment and try to start helping to close this gap, but he never did. So why do I bring this up? Well, when you look at his team, he's got a stacked roster, and I would imagine a lot of these guys are going to come into LBL with Mathieu van der Poel. He said after the race he wasn't 100%, which maybe is true, maybe he's not. I don't always take what a rider says as 100% faith, and that it's 100% correct, right? He might just be faking, and every time I look at the way the racing went, he looked so good covering all the moves. It's hard for me to imagine that he was actually hurting, but his team raced so hard for 260 kilometers, 253, sorry, that it's hard for me to believe that Mathieu van der Poel wouldn't have thrown in a big solo effort there while you're going up to Culberg with 18 kilometers to go and just bridge that gap up to the front guys if he had that kind of Paris-Roubaix form that he had when he won the weekend before. When the race finished, I talked a little bit with my old teammate Freddie Rodriguez. We were teammates with Lotto back in the day in 07, 06 and 07. And when we were teammates then, he always said a lot of times that as you're coming out of the classics, especially the flatter ones, he would come into the races with a ton of form. He'd ride really good especially one year there at Paris-Roubaix and stuff. And then he said when he tried to come over to the Ardennes Classic, it was really hard to go from the flat races into the hillier races. And I believe that's true. I believe because you have Flanders, because of course you have Paris-Roubaix, that's a week right there. But if you back it all the way up to E3 Saxo Bank, where Mathieu van der Poel was on good form there, now he's carrying form for a really long time. And then you have the switch of going from the slightly flatter races into a different rhythm of the legs. So it could be that Mathieu van der Poel is still really good, but he just needs to change the rhythm in the legs to get more used to the hillier stuff, where the RPM is going to be a little bit different and the speed's not going to be so fast in the RPMs and the pedals like you have in the flatter races, especially when you compare it to Paris-Roubaix, where they had a tailwind pushing them for most of that 250-something, 60-something kilometer race at Paris-Roubaix. So Mathieu van der Poel might get better at LBL. But let's say they start LBL and he feels the same way. And remember, when we're here at Amstel Gold on yesterday's race, when the race started, he might have felt really good, and that's why he used all of his teammates up, because he felt good, and then maybe just at the end of the race, he started losing a little something. Maybe it was something as simple as calories, because when you look as good as Mathieu van der Poel did when he's covering those attacks, and I'm sitting on the Chesterfield watching now, I'm thinking, okay, what's wrong? He's not attacking, which is a sign that he's not good, but he's able to follow some top quality moves from Carapaz, from Skilmos, from Benoit Cosnefroid, and from Michael Matthews. So when he talks after the race in the press interview saying, well, he's just a little bit off, he's hoping that LBL goes good. That could be the case. He could be good, or his form could be dropping. We got a lot of things to pay attention to, and Alpecin de Koenig have a big crisis on their hand when LBL starts, because they're going to need Mathieu van der Poel, much like I was in 2015 and 2016 with the two teams here, to know just how good he is at the start of the race. Because if he's not good, and you miss the break with all of your Alpecin de Koenig riders not being in the front group at LBL, well, then you're going to get put on the front, and you're going to have to burn up all your guys. And let me remind you guys, Quinten Hermans went second 2 years ago here at LBL, and he's on flying form with his Basque Country win. When we look at Søren Kragh Andersen's won 2 stages of Tour de France stages. He's a solid rider. We look at Axel Laurence. Laurence just got done winning a stage and went deep in Amstel Gold, but he won a stage at Catalonia before Amstel Gold, excuse me. But we see that they're all on form. Gianni Vermeersch, we don't know the problem yet. I tried to look up some information, and possibly he's going over to LBL too, but he looked good, of course, at Flanders, which is slightly hilly, so he could be solid when we're looking at LBL. But if Mathieu van der Poel is not honest with his form the minute that Liege-Bastogne starts, he needs to be completely honest. Hey, I don't have it. If you guys missed the move and I don't have it, I don't want you to ride the front. We're just going to tell the other teams, you guys got to ride the front. Maybe it's easiest for Alpecin de Koenig, if he's not really good, that then he's going to have to ride the front. But the problem is, if we look at Amstel Gold, he still could be better than all of his teammates, but we don't know. They don't know. I don't know. Anyone tells you that they do know, even Mathieu van der Poel himself, unless he was holding his cards to his chest at Amstel Gold and just said, hey, I'm using this for training, which is a possibility. I wouldn't use it for training, as I told you in the butterfly effect, but if he just used it for training, he might have just come out of Amstel Gold with some really nice spinning in his legs, because he's got that kind of power where Amstel Gold might not be putting the nails in his legs that they did in my legs when I did it back in the day, because I'm a smaller rider. He's at the right size to be a guy that can really have power for Amstel Gold. Maybe it didn't affect him the way it affected me when I started doing these classic races. But if he comes out of Amstel Gold and he's really just saving his legs, Liege-Bastogne-Liege, he should be 100%. If he was really behind the 8 ball like he said, Liege-Bastogne-Liege, he's going to still be behind the 8 ball, or even worse, because we start getting deep now into his top form. So when we get to LBL, it's going to be interesting to watch where Mathieu van der Poel's form is, because of course, page 2 looks about the same with at least 10, 12, 15 riders on page 2. But page 1, we're adding Tadej Pogačar because the Slovenian's coming for Liege-Bastogne-Liege, which could make it easier for Mathieu van der Poel to just go, hey, my legs weren't that good at Amstel Gold. If he was faking there, now he's good at Liege-Bastogne-Liege. He lets Tadej Pogacar do a lot of the pulling at Liege-Bastogne-Liege, and we see some fireworks from Mathieu van der Poel when we get into the final climbs, especially when we're talking about the last 15-20 kilometers of Liege-Bastogne-Liege, when it really gets into the stick heavy part there and deep kilometers of Liege-Bastogne-Liege. If Tadej Pogacar's made the mistake of towing Mathieu van der Poel because he thought he wasn't good at Amstel Gold, well, he could pay the price for that big time. But it's Tadej Pogacar. Does he ever pay the price? Well, we'll have to watch Liege-Bastogne-Liege. Make sure you guys like and subscribe. I'll bring you some more content on Beyond the Coverage real soon.